The sun sank heavy and red behind the jagged ridges of the Arizona territory, bleeding its last light across the desert like a wound that wouldn't heal. Dust clung to the air, thick with the smell of horses, sweat, and the faint tang of gunpowder that never seemed to leave this land. In the distance, a lone rider urged his bay gelding down a narrow trail carved between cactus and stone. His name was Caleb Mercer, 19 years old, lean as a fence rail, with restless green eyes that held the weight of a boy forced into a man's life too soon. Caleb had been raised on the bones of hardship. His father, a rancher with more pride than cattle, had gambled away land and stock until only debts remained. When cholera took him in the spring of '72, he left his son nothing but unpaid markers and the bitter taste of disgrace. Caleb should have been free, young enough to start fresh, ride north, find work, maybe even strike gold in the Black Hills. But life in the West was never so simple. A promise bound him tighter than any rope, his father's dying bargain with a widow 3 decades older than Caleb himself. Margaret Holloway was 50 when she laid her claim. A woman carved of stone and sorrow, she had survived 2 husbands, both dead by bullet and fever, and clung to her ranch like a hawk guarding its last chick. With no children of her own and no kin left alive, Margaret struck a deal with Caleb's father. If Caleb married her, the debt would be forgiven, and the Holloway spread. 200 acres of parched land, a modest herd of longhorns, and a house weathered gray by time, would become his someday. The townsfolk laughed when they heard. Some jeered, some pitied. A 19-year-old tied to a woman old enough to be his mother. In a land where men usually took brides barely out of girlhood, it sounded like a cruel jest whispered in a saloon haze. But it wasn't jest, it was binding. Caleb had ridden hard to escape it once, drifting to Tombstone with nothing but his saddle and a half-broken colt. 45, but the sheriff brought him back under orders of the debt holder's contract. Sheriff Clay McGraw, a man with iron, gray whiskers and a reputation for being harder than the land itself, told Caleb plain, "You don't marry Margaret Holloway, boy. You'll rot in Yuma prison for your daddy's debts. Those are the terms. You decide which news you prefer." And so, beneath the half-burnt rafters of the town's chapel, with only the sheriff, a reluctant preacher, and the whispers of curious onlookers as witness, Caleb Mercer wed Margaret Holloway. The kiss was brief, awkward, more a sealing of contract than union of hearts. Her lips were dry, her hands calloused like old leather. Caleb wanted to spit the taste of obligation from his mouth, but he forced himself still. Margaret's eyes, blue, faded, but piercing, watched him with something unreadable, not love, not cruelty, just survival. That was 3 weeks ago. Now, as Caleb rode back from the trading post with a sack of flour tied to his saddle, he felt the weight of that decision gnawing at him. Marriage was supposed to be freedom from loneliness, from drifting nights under cold stars. Instead, he felt caged, bound not by iron bars, but by duty to a woman who seemed carved from the same stone as her ranch. The Holloway place was no paradise. A squat ranch house leaned against the wind, shutters rattling in the endless gust. The corral held half-wild cattle that bowled at nothing. The well sputtered more dust than water most days, and Margaret herself worked harder than any man Caleb had known, rising before dawn, hauling, mending, branding. She didn't smile. She didn't complain. She simply endured. Caleb often wondered if she cared that her new husband slept in the barn most nights, too restless to share her roof. She never mentioned it. Perhaps she preferred it that way. But the land had a way of testing every soul bold enough to claim it, and Caleb would soon learn that the strangest unions could forge the fiercest bonds when fire came licking at their heels. The first trial came with outlaws. They arrived at dusk, 5 riders moving like shadows across the horizon. Dust cloaked their faces. But Caleb saw the glint of pistols at their hips and the swagger of men who believed the world owed them everything. He was forking hay into the trough when he spotted them, heart thudding against his ribs. "Margaret," he shouted, dropping the fork. "Riders comin'." She stepped out onto the porch, rifle already in her hands. Steady as if she'd been born with it. Her jaw tightened. "I know their kind." The riders pulled up before the corral, horses snorting, eyes narrow under the brim of wide hats. Their leader, A scarred man with a red bandana and teeth stained by tobacco grinned wide. "Even him," he drawled. "Name's Harlan Pike. My boys and me been ridin' long. Thought we might water our horses and share in your hospitality." His tone made it clear hospitality meant surrender. Margaret raised her rifle an inch higher. "Ain't nothin' here for you." Caleb's blood burned hot. He wanted to grab his Colt, stand beside her, but fear gnawed his gut. He was no gunslinger. He'd never faced down more than a rattlesnake. Yet the sight of Margaret, solid, unflinching, shamed him into motion. He stepped up, thumb brushing the Colt's hammer. "Best keep ridin'," he said, voice cracking just enough to betray his youth. The outlaws chuckled low and cruel. Harlan Pike spat into the dust. "Ain't he somethin'? Her little calf tryin' to grow horns." He leaned forward in the saddle. "Listen, boy. We're tackin' water, we're tackin' food, and maybe we're tackin' more. Step aside, or we'll lay you in the dirt." Caleb's hand trembled on the Colt. He thought of running, of hiding, of letting them strip the ranch bare. But then he looked at Margaret. Not once did she flinch. Not once did her rifle waver. In that moment, Caleb saw not just an old woman clinging to land. He saw a fighter who'd buried husbands, braved storms, and stared death in the eye without blinking. And something inside him snapped taut. He drew the Colt. The standoff thickened, air humming with the possibility of lead. The outlaws shifted in their saddles, hands drifting to guns. Then, like a snake striking, Margaret fired. Her bullet split the water bucket at Pike's feet, sending a spray of splinters into the dust. "That's your warning shot," she said coolly. "The next one's between your eyes." Caleb's pulse hammered so loud he could barely hear Pike's snarl. The outlaw glared, weighing odds. A woman past her prime and a boy barely grown. Easy pickings. But Margaret's steady aim told another story, and the Colt in Caleb's hand, though shaking, was real enough. Finally, Pike spat again. "Ain't worth the trouble tonight." He wheeled his horse. But this ain't over. The riders thundered away, dust boiling in their wake. Caleb exhaled hard, lowering his gun. His knees nearly buckled. He expected Margaret to scold him for trembling, for looking like a scared pup. Instead, she only nodded once. "Not bad," she said, then turned back to the porch. It was the first sliver of respect she'd given him. That night, Caleb lay awake in the barn loft, staring at the stars through the cracks in the roof. His hands still shook from the standoff, but his mind burned with new fire. Margaret wasn't just some burden chained to his life. She was steel in a world of dust. Maybe, just maybe, there was something to learn from her. But danger had only just begun to circle. Harlan Pike wasn't the kind of man to let insult go unanswered. And before long, Caleb would find himself standing not only for Margaret but beside her, in blood and gunfire, as the desert tested whether their strange marriage was curse or salvation. The days after Harlan Pike's visit crawled heavy as a wounded coyote. Caleb felt the land itself holding its breath, waiting for the storm that Pike had promised. Every creak of the windmill, every howl of a coyote in the canyons made his hand twitch toward the Colt at his hip. Margaret, by contrast, seemed unshaken. She rose at dawn, worked the herd, patched the fence, and carried water like Pike's threat had never been spoken. But Caleb noticed subtle shifts. Her rifle leaned closer at hand. Her eyes lingered longer on the horizon. She wasn't blind. She was bracing. "Why don't we tell the sheriff?" Caleb asked one morning as he tightened the girth on his gelding. Clay McGraw's tough. He'd ride out if he knew trouble was comin'. Margaret shook her head. Her hair, once golden, was now streaked silver, tucked under her broad, brimmed hat. "Sheriff's got a town to guard. Out here, we stand for ourselves. Always have. But, Pike, he's comin' back. You know he is." Her gaze was steady. "Then we'll be ready." Caleb swallowed hard. He wanted to believe in her certainty, but fear gnawed him raw. He wasn't ready, not for a gang of cutthroats hardened by blood and dust. Still, something about Margaret's calmness steadied him, even as the noose of danger tightened. Pike's return came 3 nights later. The desert wind carried it first, the faint thump of hooves in the dark. Caleb jerked awake in the barn, heart drumming. He grabbed his Colt, scrambled down the ladder, and saw lantern light bobbing in the distance. 5, maybe 6 riders, their silhouettes crawling over the ridge like black ants against the moon. "Margaret!" he hissed, sprinting toward the house. She was already on the porch, rifle in hand, eyes cold as the desert stars. "Get inside." "No," Caleb said, surprising even himself. "I'm standin' with you." For the first time, her lips curved, not quite a smile, but close. She nodded once. "Then stay sharp." The riders fanned out around the yard, their lanterns throwing shadows across the coral. Pike rode front and center, his grin wolfish in the glow. "Well now," he drawled, "ain't this cozy? Thought we'd come back for our share, since you were too stubborn to share last time." He glanced at Caleb. "And the calf's still trying to play bull." Caleb's stomach nodded, but he didn't flinch. "Ain't nothing here for you but lead Pike." The outlaw chuckled, low and mean. "Reckon we'll see." And then guns thundered. The yard exploded with chaos, flashes of fire, shouts, the whinny of terrified horses. Margaret dropped one rider with a clean shot through the chest. Caleb's Colt roared in his hand, the recoil jolting him to the bone. He didn't aim pretty, but luck, or God, guided his bullet into another outlaw's shoulder, spinning him from the saddle. "Barn," Margaret barked, and they dove for cover as slugs chewed the wood around them. Splinters bit Caleb's cheek, hot and sharp. His ears rang with the scream of gunfire. "Keep low," she hissed, shoving shells into her rifle. "Don't waste shots." Caleb's hands shook as he reloaded, fumbling cartridges. He wanted to run, to disappear into the desert, but Margaret's calm steadied him. He raised his Colt, fired again, saw another rider reel. Pike cursed, spurring his horse closer. "Burn it," he roared. "Smoke 'em out." One outlaw leapt from the saddle, torch in hand, rushing toward the barn. Caleb's blood froze. Fire meant death. Before he could move, Margaret's rifle cracked. The torch bearer dropped, the flame dying in the dirt. Pike howled with fury. "This land ain't worth dying for!" he shouted. Margaret rose just enough to glare over the barrel of her rifle. Her voice carried like steel. "It's mine. Always will be." The words struck Caleb deeper than the gunfire. He saw it then. Her fight wasn't just stubbornness. It was survival, carved into her bones after a lifetime of loss. And somehow, he realized, her fight had become his. The outlaws faltered. 2 dead, 1 wounded, and the rest spooked by the widow's unyielding stand. Pike spat curses, then yanked his reins. "This ain't finished." He snarled before galloping into the night. The survivors followed, their shadows swallowed by the desert. Silence returned, broken only by the wheeze of the wounded outlaw crawling in the dirt. Caleb's chest heaved, hands still trembling around the Colt. His ears rang, his body buzzed with the fire of survival. Margaret lowered her rifle, eyes scanning the horizon. Then she looked at him, really looked, and said softly, "You did good." It was the first time he'd heard warmth in her voice. The wounded outlaw lived long enough to be dragged into town and thrown into Sheriff McGraw's jail. Under pressure, he sang like a jaybird, spilling names, hideouts, plans. Pike wasn't just a drifter, he was leader of a gang wanted in 3 territories. The sheriff listened, then fixed Caleb and Margaret with a hard stare. "Pike won't let this go. He'll be back, meaner than ever. And next time, he'll come for blood. What do you suggest?" Margaret asked. McGraw sighed heavy. "Only thing keepin' Pike's kind at bay is a bullet or the gallows. If he rides back, it'll come to a showdown." His eyes slid to Caleb. "Might be you, boy, standin' in the street with him." Caleb's mouth went dry. Him, dual Pike. He'd barely survived by luck. But Margaret's steady presence beside him kept him from collapsing. "We'll be ready," she said firmly. The sheriff nodded. "High noon, more'n likely. That's Pike's way, make a spectacle of it." The next days blurred into preparation. Caleb practiced until his palms blistered, firing at bottles lined on fence posts, forcing himself to breathe slow, aim steady. Margaret watched in silence, correcting his grip, teaching him patience. "Don't rush," she said one evening as the sun bled red across the desert. "A quick draw's no good if you can't hit what you aim at." Caleb glanced at her. "You think I can beat him?" Her eyes, sharp as ever, softened just a fraction. "I think you've got more fight than you know. And I think you're not alone anymore." The words sank deep, heavier than any bullet. When Pike returned, it was exactly as the sheriff predicted. High noon. The sun blazed white hot overhead, baking the dirt street of town. Folks lined the boardwalks, whispers thick as flies. Pike strutted from the saloon, gun low at his hip, grin wide. Across the street, Caleb stood tall. His heart hammered, his mouth dry as bone, but his hand was steady on the Colt. Margaret stood behind him, silent, unflinching, a pillar of strength. "Boy," Pike called, voice dripping mockery. "You really think you're man enough to face me?" Caleb swallowed, raised his chin. "Ain't about be man enough. It's about being done runnin'." The street went still. Hands hovered. The clock struck 12. Pike's hand blurred, iron flashing. But Caleb's Colt barked first, clean, sharp. The outlaw's grin froze, eyes wide with shock, before he crumpled into the dust. Silence held the town for a breath. Then the crowd erupted. Shouts, gasps, cheers. Caleb's knees threatened to buckle, but he stayed standing, Colt smoking in his hand. Margaret stepped beside him, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. Pride, fierce and quiet, shone in her eyes. And in that moment, Caleb understood. The marriage forced upon him had forged something neither of them expected. A partnership tempered in fire, bound not by love's sweetness but by survival's steel. They would endure. Together. The desert wind swept down the street, carrying dust over Pike's lifeless body. Life in the West went on, hard, merciless, but theirs to claim. And so the boy who had been forced into shackles of marriage stood free at last, not by breaking them, but by learning that sometimes the chains you curse can become the very bonds that save you.